And we certainly welcome her back and are very receptive to comments like this.
And we'll leave this conversation at this point to go live to Capitol Hill now to the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on the Environment to get testimony from Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Andrew Wheeler. He's reviewing and answering questions about the President's fiscal year 2020 budget request. Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski is the chair of the subcommittee. Live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
Good morning, everyone. The committee will come to order. We are kicking off the first of our hearings as they relate to Interior Appropriations, and you are our invited guests. Congratulations, Administrator Wheeler, on your recent confirmation. Thank you for being here this morning, along with Holly Graves, to discuss the year 2020 budget request for the Environmental Protection Agency. For those on the committee, I think it's always good to set at the first of the hearings just kind of the order of process around here. We've always followed the early bird rule as long as I have been chairman, so we're going to call on members in order in which they arrive, going back and forth, 5 minutes.
Tester's a serious early bird.
He is a very serious early bird, and we recognize that and appreciate that. You were correct in that. I am the one that is late. I am not the early bird this morning, so I'm going to defer to you, in fact, when we start off. But the goal this morning, and the reason we did start a little bit earlier, is we all know we have a joint session that we're required to be to, or we're asked to be there at 10:40. I know the administrator is hoping to attend that as well, so I'd like to be able to wrap this up by 10:30. I know that there are a lot of different appropriations subcommittee meetings at the same time. We may both be popping in and out of them, so it's good to be able to start a little bit earlier. When I'm home, I certainly see firsthand the impacts of EPA on the lives of Alaskans when it comes to the health of our communities. From restoring contaminated sites to ensuring clean drinking water, the EPA touches the lives of Americans across our country every day, and that's why supporting EPA's core responsibilities of clean air, clean water, and clean land is so important. I do appreciate, Administrator Wheeler, the work that you've done on returning EPA to more of a back-to-basics management approach instead of pushing a one-size-fits-all regulatory agenda that exceeds the statutory authority of the EPA. We've seen within this administration a shift back to prioritizing programs with actual on-the-ground cleanup and real environmental benefits. So I think you're on the right track there. The agency under your leadership must continue to implement a regulatory agenda that supports responsible development and robust environmental protections achieved through a cooperative federalism approach with the states and in consultation with the tribes. So whether it's the work that the agency has done in revising the WOTUS rule or addressing the very important issue of climate change, we must be partners in supporting the responsibilities of the agency. So turning to the FY 2020 EPA budget, the budget request totals approximately $6.1 billion, nearly a 30% reduction. The agency's proposal is similar to past requests from this administration, and I underscore that it is just that. It is a proposal. And while I appreciate this budget's recognition of numerous programs that do have bipartisan support, many of the reductions would, in my view, be inconsistent with some of the back-to-basics approach that I just mentioned. Many of the grant programs that are critical to EPA's core mission of protecting the health of our communities are proposed for significant reductions. These grant programs lead to tangible environmental and human health benefits by supporting contaminated site cleanup, financing drinking water and sanitation infrastructure, and more. I've worked really hard with folks up in my state over the years to really make sure that we are doing right by some of these smaller programs that really do have on-the-ground benefit and impact. The Targeted Airshed Grants Program, which is helping to reduce air pollution for Alaskans, particularly in Fairbanks, is eliminated in this budget, and that's something that we have seen very direct and immediate benefit. In fact, I've got a letter of support from one of the agencies up north there, again reminding us that this is one of the few areas that they've been able to make some headway there. The Alaska Native Village Program is proposed for an 85% reduction, even though this funding is critical to supporting the water infrastructure needs of Native Alaskans who face, as you know, some pretty incredible cost of living based on transportation just due to the remoteness. But EPA programs like this help meet those challenges, so I'm going to continue to provide my attention and support to them. The agency's budget request makes large reductions to state grant programs, such as the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds, which I know is a concern to many of my colleagues here. I do appreciate that this request includes a proposal for a new $50 million grant program to study and resolve environmental hazards at our nation's schools. I think this is something that is a mission well deserving of our support. So I'm pleased that that is in there. Well, I do understand the tough budget environment this proposal was crafted in. The final budget for EPA, as crafted by Congress, I think will look substantially different than this request. As I mentioned earlier, Congress is a critical partner of the EPA on protecting the health of our communities and addressing the many environmental needs of our country. So I look forward to working with you on implementing the budget that Congress will provide the EPA for FY 2020. So to close, I'd like to thank you for your commitment to continue working with me on a number of the more parochial issues that face our state, fish grinding, small remote incinerators, PM 2.5 in Fairbanks. You've heard about all of them many, many times, and know that I'll be asking some questions about them this morning. And now I will turn to my ranking member, Senator Udall. And as I do, I just want to acknowledge, with your announcement that you're going to be retiring at the end of this Congress, know that it has been a privilege and a pleasure to work with you and your team on this subcommittee. I know we have a lot of work to do before we do real serious thank yous, but as we're kicking off the beginning of this appropriations cycle, know how much I appreciate the good working relationship we have.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and real pleasure always to work with you. And Administrator Wheeler, welcome today as you're hearing as the EPA Administrator. I'm sure it's a different day from when we sat here 1 year ago with your predecessor. So I first want to acknowledge your efforts to restore basic communication with the Congress. While we have our disagreements, I do appreciate that today we can focus on the mission of the EPA. Now, it's no secret that I opposed your nomination to lead the EPA. I just don't think it's in the best interest of this country for a former industry lobbyist to be in charge of agencies that regulate their former clients on environmental policy or anything else. A lobbyist who has advocated for easing and even dismantling protections for public health and the environment. While you promised that your previous work poses no conflict of interest with your current position, your actions and leadership indicate that public health and the environment do not come first in your decision-making. But Mr. Wheeler, you have been narrowly confirmed by the Senate, and today you testify before us as the administrator of the EPA. And after nearly a year of experience as acting administrator, now it's time to examine the record. I'm relieved that your predecessor is no longer dominating the news cycle with daily scandals, but the bottom line is that I don't see much of a change in terms of policy. I'm deeply troubled that as acting administrator and now as the confirmed administrator, you are continuing to implement this administration's devastating environmental agenda. First and foremost, this administration has abandoned all efforts to fight climate change, and you've personally doubled down on that by denying climate change is even a major crisis. Administrator Wheeler, climate change is a major and very real crisis. In fact, climate change is by far the most pressing crisis of our time. People are losing their homes, their land, their farms. We now have a new kind of refugee, climate refugees, displaced from their homes by catastrophic weather disasters like drought and floods. In the West, we have less precipitation. Rivers and reservoirs are running at historic lows. Dry conditions are creating more wildfires. Look at the historic devastating floods in the Midwest happening as we speak. In Puerto Rico, the death toll from the destructive Hurricane Maria was 2,975 American lives. The planet and the people living on it are suffering, especially those who can least afford to adapt. Yet instead of recognizing reality right out of the gate, this administration began an all-out assault on efforts to fight climate change by blocking common sense proposals to limit emissions from power plants, by halting efforts to control methane from oil and gas operations, by weakening fuel economy standards, and by walking away from the Paris Climate Accords. If you do not change course, this will be your legacy. And I don't think history will look upon this record very kindly. And it's not just climate policy that is so devastating. It seems there isn't one rock overturned at the EPA where this administration hasn't taken an opportunity to roll back public health and environmental protections to benefit corporations and industry. Just recently, the agency dramatically scaled back proposed limits on a deadly chemical in paint strippers. While the chemical will be taken off the shelves in home improvement stores, the people who face the most risk, workers exposed to this neurotoxin every day, still have zero protections. At the center of this administration's action plan to protect the public from PFAS and related chemicals, which are associated with cancer, autoimmune diseases, and even resistance to vaccines, is a vague promise to start thinking about setting health standards sometime soon. Meanwhile, an estimated tens of millions of Americans are drinking water that contain these substances at levels much higher than what independent scientists and even the Centers for Disease Control consider to be safe. And that's not to mention impacts like the farmers in New Mexico who are being forced to destroy hundreds of thousands of gallons of contaminated milk and euthanize thousands of cattle. EPA also recently declared that it is no longer appropriate and necessary to limit mercury and other toxic air pollution, pollution that is known to poison fetuses and children. EPA's decision paves the way to undermine basic public health standards. That's why it immediately drew bipartisan opposition in Congress. And contrary to a court order, EPA recently decided to let the hard rock mining industry shirk financial responsibility for the environmental cost of doing business, even though damages from abandoned mines have cost taxpayers billions of dollars. The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office just recently reported that EPA political appointees directly interfered with EPA scientists' important work related to evaluating the hazards of chemicals we come in contact with every day. And we're still waiting for EPA to make good on its promise to take care of people and farmers, including New Mexicans and members of the Navajo Nation who were harmed by the Gold King mine spill. Another promise broken. When it comes to the budget, it's just one more of the same. The administration, for the third year in a row, proposes devastating cuts to the EPA. It's unconscionable to me that the agency responsible for protecting public health would propose to scale back on the very scientific research that helps us identify threats and understand to minimize them. But this budget requests a cut of 43% to EPA research. The budget also proposes a cut of 12% to the enforcement laws designed to protect the water we drink and the air we breathe. The proposed cut to enforcement even includes criminal activities like illegally dumping sewage into drinking water sources. I fail to understand how we need less investment in keeping environmental cops on the beat. The budget exposes the administration's rhetoric about deferring to state-level environmental efforts is completely phony. The budget proposes to cut more than a third, a total of $1.5 billion from states and tribes. Yet another fake promise from this administration is infrastructure funding. A quick look at the budget request shows an $875 million cut to water infrastructure. That's more than a 30% cut. I'd like to talk about these proposed cuts today, but to be honest, I'm tired of the now commonplace responses from the representatives of this administration in budget hearings. We hear repeatedly, year after year, that they would be, quote, happy to work with Congress on final spending levels It's a wink and a nod that the budget request isn't really real, but that, I submit to you, makes it a mockery of the process. Budgets are statements of policy priorities, and proposed cuts of this terrible degree show us in clear print what this administration is about. Industry comes before public health and environmental protection. There's no wink or nod or announcement at a rally that can undo that. I continue to be thankful this committee is stuck together, really appreciate working with the chairman on priorities that the American people really care about and doing things on a bipartisan basis and rejecting these drastic proposals. But the agency is still suffering. Morale is at an all-time low among EPA scientists and other experts, and staffing levels are waning because despite Congress rejecting budget cuts, the agency is not hiring new staff when previous staff depart. I know, Administrator Wheeler, you have a lot to say today on your funding priorities for EPA, important things we can all agree on, like improving the health of school facilities and reducing lead in drinking water. But I want to be clear that these shouldn't and won't distract the American people from the failures of this administration to fight climate change and protect public health. I look forward to our discussion today, and thank you, Madam Chair, for those very kind comments early on, and look forward to working through this budget process with you.
Thank you, Senator Udall. Administrator Wheeler, you've got a lot that goes on within the department, a lot that is, as you know and we know, very important to people throughout the nation. So if you would please commence your comments this morning with regards to the President's fiscal year 2020 budget.
Thank you, Chairman. And good morning, Chairman Murkowski and Ranking Member Udall and members of the subcommittee. I am joined today by Holly Greaves, my CFO, and we're here today to discuss EPA's proposed 2020 budget. The budget request ensures that the agency can continue President Trump's bold agenda and the tremendous progress we have made over the past 2 years. The U.S. is a global leader in clean air and access to safe drinking water, and we are cleaning up contaminated lands at the fastest pace in over a decade. At the same time, EPA has finalized 38 deregulatory actions, saving Americans more than $3 billion in regulatory costs. We have an additional 39 actions in development to save billions more. The Trump administration is proving that environmental protection and historic economic growth can go hand in hand. My testimony will highlight how the President's budget would continue this progress. I believe that water issues, from drinking water to marine litter to infrastructure, are the largest and most immediate environmental issue affecting the world today. The budget request provides critical support for water quality protection. One challenge we face is lead exposure. Through the new Federal Lead Action Plan, EPA is coordinating with our federal counterparts to reduce childhood lead exposure. On Monday, we issued a status report to hold ourselves accountable to the public and clearly communicate the steps we are taking to implement the action plan. To bolster these efforts, the budget proposes $50 million to establish a new Healthy Schools grant program to reduce exposure to lead or other toxics in schools. We are also moving forward to update the lead and copper rule for the first time in over 2 decades. Our proposal will ensure that we address the most corrosive pipes in the most at-risk communities first. Another challenge is addressing potential sources of contamination. In February, EPA released its PFAS Action Plan, the most comprehensive multimedia research and action plan ever issued by the agency to address an emerging chemical of concern. On the marine litter issue, billions of pounds of waste enter our oceans each year, harming marine life and coastal economies. EPA's Trash-Free Waters program is stepping up to help the international community capture marine litter or prevent it from reaching the ocean. On infrastructure, the President's budget includes a 25% increase to WIFIA from last year's request. This new program is already producing tremendous results. To date, EPA has issued 8 WIFIA loans totaling more than $2 billion in federal credit assistance. Last week, we announced our 3rd round of funding, which could support $12 billion in water infrastructure projects and create more than 180,000 jobs. To expand on these efforts, President Trump signed America's Water Infrastructure Act, OWIA. While funding for OWIA was not included in the fiscal year 2019 appropriations the Congress enacted, EPA proposes funding of $83 million in this budget request to begin implementation of the law. The budget request also includes approximately $2 billion in federal dollars towards the 2 SRFs. The combination of federal grants, state matches, repayments, and interest all flow back into each revolving fund, creating $80 billion in the nationwide fund as of today, well beyond the annual SRF investments. Regarding the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, as the President stated, this is a unique and important program. I fully support his decision as it relates to funding the program. When it comes to reducing air pollution, we're moving forward with common sense reforms that will help more communities reach attainment of the NAAQS standards. For example, we are set to announce that the Cleveland area is now meeting the standards for particulate matter later this week. The cleanup of contaminated lands also plays a crucial role in revitalizing communities throughout the country. In fiscal year 2018, EPA deleted all or part of 22 sites from the national priorities list, the largest number of deletions in 1 year since fiscal year 2005. Our next responsibility is ensuring that chemicals used in commerce and sold in the marketplace are safe for public use. I'm proud to report that EPA continues to meet the major statutory deadlines of the amended TSCA. Earlier this month, we finalized a ban on the retail sale of methylene chloride for consumer paint and coating removal, the first risk management action under Section 6 of the amended TSCA. To ensure our efforts are effective and durable, EPA has a healthy and robust enforcement program. At one end of the spectrum, we are increasing compliance through self-audits, which are often the quickest way to correct environmental harms. At the other end of the spectrum, we are deterring noncompliance by increasing the number of new criminal cases, reversing a downward trend that began in 2011. We want the public to know that when they encounter environmental threats, we will address them head on. And we want the world to know that when they encounter environmental threats, we are ready to help. This type of leadership that gives confidence to the public, the regulated community, and our allies around the globe. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Administrator. Let me begin my questions. This relates to something that Senator Udall has raised. I have raised it by way of letter. I think many of us on the committee has, because so many around the country are realizing the challenges that our communities are facing when it comes to PFAS contamination. In my state, we've got communities that we're hearing from, like Utqiagvik, Fairbanks, Dillingham, Gustavus, where they're seeing groundwater that has been contaminated with PFAS, largely due to the use of this fluorinated firefighting foam. So you've released this PFAS action plan. There's some promises out there with regards to declaring certain compounds as hazardous. But can you give the committee some estimate in terms of EPA's timeline for listing PFAS or any of the compounds as hazardous substances? And really, what are these comprehensive steps? You've indicated in your testimony here this morning that there's going to be a media rollout. What are we going to see?
Senator, first of all, I want to assure you and the committee that while we were developing the hazardous waste for PFAS, PFOA, and the different compounds, as well as looking at the groundwater standards and looking to include it under TRI for releases, we are still enforcing. We're enforcing our health advisory of 70 parts per trillion. We have taken, I believe, 8 enforcement actions along with the states, and we've assisted the states and local communities in dozens of other enforcement actions. Where we see PFAS, where we find it, where it's a threat to drinking water, we're ensuring that it's cleaned up. We're actually using state-of-the-art GIS mapping technologies to determine where we believe it is. We know where the chemicals were produced, in large part in Parkersburg, West Virginia, as well as Cape Fear, North Carolina. And we also know the areas where it was used the most. A lot of airports, Department of Defense facilities. So we're using our GIS tracking to map where we believe, laying on top of groundwater and drinking water systems, to identify the communities that may be at risk, and then helping them look to see if they do have a problem with their drinking water. And where we are finding it, we are enforcing. So we're not stopping enforcement of cleaning up PFAS and PFOA where we find it, while we work on additional tools. We have a number of tools that we already are using, such as the health advisory of 70 parts per trillion. At the same time, our research office is doing more research on identifying where the chemicals are, identifying which types. There's over, I believe, 2,000 different PFAS, PFOA substances, long chain, short chain. We're trying to determine which of those would be have the most health risk. It's also important to note that the cleanup technologies differ depending on the type of PFAS and PFOA chemical compound itself. We can't use the same cleanup technology for all of the PFAS, PFOA compounds. I've been at our RTP lab in North Carolina and met with our researchers there. I've met with our researchers in some of our regional labs, and last week I was at our Cincinnati lab, where they're doing some groundbreaking research on how to clean up the PFOA, PFAS chemicals, and how to identify where they are, and how to identify which ones are the most harmful to the public health. So we're doing. We're setting the standards. We're working with the states and other agencies that have standards and other health advisories for PFAS, PFOA. We're still enforcing our health advisory. We're actually actively looking to see where it may be to help those communities. And we're also conducting important research that will help us not only identify, but identify which ones are the most harmful, and also identify how we clean up, the best technologies to clean them up when we find them.
Well, I appreciate that update. It is something that the folks that I'm talking to are like, we know that we have a serious issue here, but how do we even get started? So being able to identify, map it, and obviously know how to address it is going to be critically important going forward. I know you're going to have other questions on that. Let me just ask one more quick question for you, and this is something that I never thought that I was going to have to ask. I was born down in Ketchikan, Alaska. It's a rainforest down there. It is truly a rainforest. Well, in this rainforest, in the Tongass, we're seeing a drought this past year. The communities of Ketchikan, Wrangell, and Petersburg are communities that primarily rely on hydroelectric power, and they have faced some significant energy shortages resulting from these drought conditions in a rainforest, crazily enough. This is something that we hope is not a new normal, but what has happened is these are all communities, again, they're not connected by any kind of a power grid or a transmission system. They're all islands there. So they rely on diesel generation as backup for the community. So EPA gives Title V air quality permits to power plants that allow them to operate during certain hours, establishing allowable diesel generation operating hours. And many of these plants in Southeast Alaska normally only use a fraction of this permitted operating hours in a year, but because of what we've seen with this drought and our water reservoir levels so low, we're seeing increased diesel generation use. So what I need from you this morning is a commitment to basically work with us to see if there's any relief that these affected communities may have in dealing with this bump that they're coming up against with regards to the operating hours, whether it's the city of Ketchikan or some of the others. So I don't know if there are other options out there, but I'd like you to be working with us on this because it's a serious challenge for them right now.
Absolutely, Senator. We are working to provide regulatory relief for the owners and operators of these diesel generators in the remote areas of Alaska, and we do plan to take action shortly to amend the regulations to remove the problematic Tier 4 requirements that apply for remote areas of Alaska.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know the communities will look forward to that as well. Let me turn to Senator Tester, the early bird.
Yeah, well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here. Mr. Wheeler, appreciate you being here. I wasn't going to ask about PFAS, but the chair lady has brought it up. You guys said you're detecting it and you're cleaning it up where found. Has it been banned?
Yes, there was.
So you're saying that
some of the materials.
Some of the material has been banned, but they're still using PFAS in firefighting foam?
Yes, some of the PFAS, PFOA compounds, but there's thousands of them. Some of them, the worst ones were banned a number of years ago.
So I guess what I'm saying is that if you're looking on detecting it and cleaning it up, that's fine, but why aren't we banning the cause so you don't have to do that? So it's done, it causes cancer? Is there a problem with it?
The worst substances were banned a number of years ago. They're ubiquitous in consumer products.
So what you're saying is today, the stuff that's been used in the firefighting foam does not cause cancer or liver disease?
I'd have to get back to you on the exact ones that are in the firefighting foam.
So the point here is that I think it's much easier to do preventative medicine than it is to do post.
And we are looking at a significant new use rule for the PFAS, PFOA as well to make sure that as the substitutes come to the marketplace, that we're reviewing those substitutes before.
Are you familiar with Libby?
Yes,
Montana? I am. Okay, so you know that it's asbestos, incredible impacts. Serious problem. You have a document coming out called the Problem Formulation of Risk Evaluation for Asbestos. You're familiar with that, I assume?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, so it lays out how devastating asbestosis is, mesothelioma, cardiovascular, pulmonary, immunodeficiency diseases. The list goes on. Do you plan on finalizing that risk evaluation by December of this year?
Asbestos is one of the first 10 chemical substances that we're looking at under TSCA. We find it very important. We noted.
Do you plan on finalizing that report by December of this year?
That is the goal. With the shutdown in January, we're a little behind on that. But
your budget also cuts that review account by 28%, nearly 1/3. Is that going to have any impact on finalizing the risk evaluation report?
No, it should not have an impact on finalizing it. We're also doing a significant new use rule because we noted that there's a gap.
When do you anticipate,
asbestos products
how long after the risk evaluation report has been finalized do you anticipate it will take to pull asbestos off the market?
Well, as I noted, we also have a significant new use rule to try to stop the importation of new asbestos products into the United States. This is the first time any administration has addressed this since the early 90s.
We got people dying from this, okay? And it's not a pleasant death. Why is it out there? Everybody knows what the problem is. Why aren't we pulling it off the market? You're doing a risk evaluation.
We are.
You said it'd be done by December. Shouldn't it be pulled off the market? That risk evaluation, by the way, I think is going to be absolutely rock solid no-brainer, because the evidence is there. How long will it take you to pull it off?
I can't prejudge a risk assessment before it's finished.
I can.
We get into
and so if it is rock solid, how long will it take to pull it off?
If it is rock solid, we will move quickly to pull it off the market.
Is that a month?
I will have to get back to you on the exact timing and how long. We're dealing with the new TSCA, which has never been implemented before.
Gotcha.
This is the first set of 10 chemicals ever put through the program.
All right. Asbestos has been around for a long time, though.
And we're the first administration to address this in 25 years.
Clean air, all right. I got it, and I appreciate that. But because they didn't doesn't mean we shouldn't, okay?
Right.
All right. Clean air and clean water is something really important. We're just talking about air with Libby. Let's talk about water. Your predecessor said that Superfund cleanup was going to be one of his top priorities. And by the way, for all the criticisms put on your predecessor, he actually was moving forward with the Butte Superfund cleanup in Berkeley Pit in a positive way, talking with people on the ground, doing some things that are positive. Is Superfund cleanup still a priority for you?
Absolutely, and I'm the first EPA administrator to visit Butte and Anaconda in over 20 years.
Appreciate that. So right now, Butte's got one employee on the site for a few days a week. Your Superfund budget is going to be cut by over $100 million. How do you square that with cleaning up a Superfund site?
We have looking at our budget and looking at the resources, we have the people and the resources we need to get it cleaned up, and Butte is on schedule to be cleaned up with deletion by 2024, and we don't believe the budget will impact that at all.
So, okay. So you're telling me that one employee on the site for only a few days a week, now with this budget, and the budget coming up for next year being $100 million less is going to keep that on schedule for cleanup.
That one employee is not the only employee working on this site. We have a Montana field office with 4 or 5 employees. Last week, I was in Denver, and I had a conference call with the Butte and Anaconda teams, along with our Denver staff who are working on cleaning it up, and our Washington, D.C. staff. We probably had 30 staff involved in both of those sites on the call.
I appreciate your attention to it. I just want to make a real quick comment because I'm over time, but there's a piece of land that was operated by Smurfett Stone west of Missoula, Montana, on the floodplain of the Clark Fork River. I would ask you to put that on your radar if it's not already on your radar. This is a piece of property that has chemicals buried on it. We don't believe that the barrels have broken open yet and dumped into the Clark Fork, but at the point they do, it becomes a much more expensive cleanup. And if there's an opportunity for you guys to get in there, and there's still people alive that know that site, and find out where that stuff is, as much as you possibly can, it may save a lot of heartache down the road. Thank you for being here, Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Wheeler, for being here for sure. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me on the telephone. I think it was March the 21st, and about the catastrophic flooding that we're having in Mississippi. You have been so excessive, and I've had the opportunity to visit with you for at length on the telephone, so I appreciate you being accessible to me during that time. Unfortunately, the flooding, which began on February the 15th, continues today, and we had Acting Administrator for EPA Region 4, Mary Walker, to join me on a flight on March the 19th to fly over with the Corps of Engineers to observe the damage, and I certainly appreciate that time there because it has gotten worse since our conversation, and at best, it will be another month before the floodwaters fully recede, assuming the best of conditions. Today, more than 510,000 acres in this highly productive agricultural region is underwater. To put that into perspective, that's about 789 square miles, an area more than 11 times the size of the District of Columbia. It's affecting homes, roads, bridges, churches, schools. There's snakes swimming in these facilities right now, and overall health and public safety to all of the area residents. I've been over there more than once, and what we're experiencing is truly catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of acres of prime agriculture and timberland will suffer significant damage and go unplanted this season. I am talking to farmers almost daily that are in ruins there. The economic impact on agriculture alone will be in the hundreds of millions. Similar flooding has occurred not once, but 10 separate times, 10, since EPA in 2008 prohibited the Corps from completing the final aspects of a 78-year-old comprehensive flood control effort. It has been going on as long as I can remember. Because of this, residents have lost their homes and businesses. Roads and bridges have been destroyed. Wildlife is dying. Flying over, we saw all the wildlife on the levee because that was the only dry land that they could get to, and their habitat lost to contaminated floodwaters. We can all agree that decisions made in 2008 have not only failed to meet the intent with respect to the environment, wildlife, and habitat, but also placed a tremendous burden on the lives and properties of thousands of Mississippi. I am so grateful that you are giving this the attention that you've given us. We been looking forward to this day for a long time. You have been, as I said, very responsive to us, and you are certainly a light in a very dark area to us right now, and I am grateful and I appreciate you for that. But what comments will you give me that EPA will work in good faith with the Corps of Engineers toward providing the adequate level of flood protection promised to Mississippians literally since 1941?
Thank you, Senator. And my heart goes out to your constituents and the people of Mississippi with the flood that's been going on. And we're trying to help on the emergency response side, and I'll talk about that in a second. But We are working with the Army Corps of Engineers. We're reviewing the decision that was made in 2008 to veto the Army Corps plan for the Yazoo pumps, trying to determine if, in particular with the latest flooding, if that changes our determination and the work that went on in 2008 on reviewing that project. And we're reviewing more recent data and talking to the Army Corps on a near daily basis to try to figure out how we can be helpful to you, your constituents, and the Army Corps to make sure that the flooding is addressed and that we don't have floods like this going into the future. I would be remiss, however, we have incredible emergency responders across the agency at our headquarters and in all of our regions, and they respond to emergencies almost on a daily basis. Most of them are very small that most people are aware of when a train derails, when there's a small spill someplace. But I would be remiss if I did not point out that we have not had a head of our emergency response office for this administration, and we are waiting on the Senate confirmation for the head of our emergency response. He was nominated 394 days ago, and that is that's absurd that we've waited so long to have the head of our emergency response, and I really hope he will be confirmed before we hit the next hurricane season this year.
Well, thank you very much for your response, and I really look forward to working with you because I do think we can come up with some reasonable solutions, but thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hyde-Smith. Senator Udall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Wheeler, before we get into the budget, I want to start with some housekeeping. This subcommittee requires our agencies to submit reprogrammings and reorganizations for approval. Sometimes that process can take time depending on the scope of the proposal and on time it takes the agency to respond to our request for information. We require that our agencies wait to implement any reprogrammings or reorganizations until the subcommittee has completed our evaluations. Can you commit, in this fairly simple yes or no, that you and your staff will continue to follow these long-standing requirements?
Yes, I believe we have. We're working on a regional reorganization with you where we first briefed your staff last September.
And can you commit to continue responding to requests from the minority?
Yes, I believe we have responded to all of your requests, and we will continue to do so.
The budget request cuts nearly all funding for EPA's geographic programs. These programs have made real, measurable differences in environmental quality of water bodies such as the Great Lakes. This subcommittee has for 3 years running rejected the President's proposals to eliminate these programs. Last week at a rally in Michigan, the President announced he now supports full funding, $300 million for EPA's Great Lakes program. I consider that a remarkable reversal. I have to wonder if the President will make more announcements reversing his budget requests. You testified in the House yesterday that an amended budget request is in progress for the Great Lakes program. Is that correct?
Well, I believe what I said was that we're talking to OMB about what we need to do to convey the President's
Well, as you know, the proper thing to do is to submit an amended budget request, and we would expect you to do that for any of the others that he's planning on doing, rather than playing favorites and going to particular places that are important in next year's presidential elections.
We are working with OMB on that. They're the ones who submit the actual amended budget requests.
And I just don't like the idea of playing favorites. I think all of these big national programs are funded because they're important on a regional basis. And I know that your position generally is to say, oh, the states should do that. The reality is the states were not doing it. Congress stepped forward as a partner, and that's the reason we keep funding these. So I'd like you to keep that in mind when you brief the OMB and brief the President about the importance of these programs. Want to talk a little bit about the staffing crisis. This subcommittee is constantly hearing evidence that morale is at an all-time low among EPA scientists, engineers, and other experts, and the agency's staffing levels are dropping because despite Congress rejecting proposed budget cuts, the agency is not hiring new staff when previous staff depart. I see this as an intentional effort to cripple the EPA so badly that effects last well past this administration. Since the end of the previous administration, EPA has lost 8.5% of its employees. EPA's research office alone has lost a staggering 14% of staff, and staffing in the field is suffering especially. The region that includes my home state of New Mexico has lost nearly 12% of its staff, and those numbers are from January. I don't have more recent data because EPA has refused to respond to our request for more recent updates. Mr. Wheeler, when you took over as acting administrator nearly a year ago, you and I discussed the need for EPA to maintain and cultivate experienced and qualified staff. You said one of your personal priorities was to make sure that happened. But here we are a year later, and the numbers show that staffing levels are falling deeper into crisis, and that we also sit here examining a budget request to cut another 1,800 staff. That's really where you're going to take the agency, another 1,800 level. That's where you think, in terms of public health and the environment, that's where the EPA should be, 1,800 people lower.
I'm more concerned about making sure we have the right experts. I hired the first
The question is, do you want to be 1,800 people lower? That's what your budget you've put before the Congress.
If we are focusing on our core missions at the agency and protecting public health and the environment, that is the number that we believe we can accomplish those goals.
Mr. Wheeler, with all due respect,
main concern is making sure that we have the right expertise.
Yeah, I don't think you can do that with 1,800 fewer employees. And if you look at the history of the EPA over the last couple of years, I mean, we've been dropping down dramatically, and there are a number of areas where you're not on public health issues and environmental issues stepping up to the plate and doing the right thing. Are you aware, Mr. Wheeler, that Congress has rejected the President's proposals to cut EPA's budget and that we have provided nearly steady funding for EPA's operating programs?
Yes, I am aware.
Yeah. And I don't think there's any doubt that the staff is the key. I mean, these career people, you should realize it by now. If you really get into an issue, that's where you have to turn to find out what's going on. And I just think it's deplorable that we've dropped so far, and that you're on a trend right now. With this budget you presented, you're here defending where you're going to cut another 1,800. I hope, as we've done in the past, I haven't asked a question yet, I hope, as in the past on a bipartisan basis, that we continue to see the good work that is being done and that we don't engage in this cutting just for the sake of cutting. And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Administrator Wheeler, you looked like you were going to have one more comment there, but if you don't, I'm going to go to Mr. Van Hall.
Just a quick comment. The downward trend did start before this administration, but the biggest issue we have is 40% of our workforce is eligible to retire over the next 5 years. Last year, we hired 30 new people to work on TSCA, but we also lost 30 people in the same year that were working on TSCA. So we have the challenge that we have is a high number of, compared to other agencies and departments, people who are eligible to retire and are retiring, and trying to bring on the people to replace them. The hiring process is a very long process to bring on new people in the federal government. It takes months to bring on a qualified scientist. And as I said, we brought on 30 new people last year to work on TSCA. We thought we were going to have enough people to work on it, and then at the same time we had 30 people leave the agency. So we have a challenge, and I'm working very hard to address that challenge. Thank you.
Let's go to Senator Van Hollen, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Welcome, both of you. Administrator Wheeler, when you were up for your nomination hearing before the Environment and Public Works Committee, you said for the record that, quote, the EPA is fully committed to the Chesapeake Bay program. You haven't changed your position, have you?
No, Senator.
You remain fully committed to that program and think it's a good program, right?
Yes, sir.
I appreciate that because, as you know, in the President's budget, he slashes the program from $73 million a year to $7.3 million. Senator Udall mentioned that when the president was out at the Great Lakes, he on the spot restored the $300 million cut. The other day, after Secretary DeVos defended the cut to Special Olympics, the president reversed that. It does indicate that the whole process on the executive side of the ledger is a bit of a sham here, but I'm pleased that on a bipartisan basis, this committee has continued to fund these important projects. You indicated that the mission of the EPA was to protect the public health and the environment, and I assume you would agree that we should do that using the best science and the best evidence. Is that right?
Yes, Senator.
So my question is, when it comes to climate change, we just heard Senator Hyde-Smith talk about the catastrophic flooding in Mississippi. There's no doubt that we see more frequent and more intense extreme weather events. Why the EPA continues to have taken down the portion of the EPA website dealing with climate change. When you go to EPA.climate these days, you get a little headline saying, "We want to help you find what you're looking for," and it goes on. It disappeared, the previous climate change portion of the website.
It's my understanding that everything, and I've asked this question of our career technical people multiple times, that everything that is ever on the website on climate change is still available on the website. It's not highlighted to the same extent that President Obama's EPA highlighted it,
so if you
but
want
it is
to be
still on the website.
Mr. Minister, if you want to be taken seriously as an agency that believes in science, you wouldn't disappear the climate change website. Yes, you've archived what was there before the Trump administration. My understanding is when you look at your climate indicators page, you haven't been updating the graphs with the newest information. Will you commit today that you will do that?
I'll have to look into that.
Would you be surprised to learn that the climate indicators page does not allow the graphs to be updated with the most recent information?
I would have to look into that, Senator.
Well, I would hope that the credibility of the agency seems to me is on the line on these issues. People can have their own views, but when you've got the scientific community very clear on this, the evidence is overwhelming. Which leads me to another question, because I am worried about the fact that science is being displaced by sort of political science and political pressure in a number of places around the agency. There's an article, I don't know if you saw it this morning, it's headlined as "If I Worked at the EPA, I'd Resign." It's a column in the Washington Post by Bernard Goldstein. Bernard Goldstein was the chair of the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Board in the Reagan administration. He was then appointed by President Reagan to be the head of EPA's Office of Research and Development. And there are 7 members of the Scientific Advisory Board, and he points out that they rely a lot on the scientific information provided by subcommittees to the board. And then he writes, that's how it's supposed to work. In other words, they're supposed to get input from the subcommittee experts. But last October, Wheeler suddenly and high-handedly terminated the subcommittees working to develop recommendations for the particulate standards, as well as the standard for ozone pollution, which is what this advisory board is going to review next. And he says for the first time, this advisory committee will lack a single epidemiologist. So my question is why? Why eliminate the panel of experts? It seems to me it looks like another step to eliminate outside independent expert opinion.
Absolutely not, Senator. First of all, the Clean Air Act 1990 amendments requires us to review the NAAQS every 5 years. We took a hard look at what was causing the delay, because the agency has never met the 5-year time frame for ozone or PM. Part of the problem was the having the subcommittees, which are not required under the statute, took a lot of time to go back and forth between the subcommittee and the full KSAC committee. So we streamlined the KSAC review, so we will get both of those reviews for ozone and PM done within the 5 years. They will be done by the end of next year, which is the requirement under statute. And as I sat down with the head of the KSAC,
if I could just ask, I understand. Why not say to the subcommittee experts, here's your deadline, right? If you don't get us the information in time, then we're not going to be able to consider it.
Previous
Rather than
administrations
wiping
have
it
done that. Previous administrations have done
right.
that. Well,
I'm asking why this
CASAC,
administration wiped it out.
because they weren't able to meet their deadlines. They were never able to meet the 5-year deadline. Okay. So what? But I have assured the head of CASAC that if you need outside technical assistance, outside scientific review, they're still allowed and are able and can call up other. They can reach out to epidemiologists and get additional input. But it was that formal subcommittee review process that took literally months and years.
So are you wiping out all the subcommittees?
No, yes, for the ozone and PM, and then we'll see how that goes as far as the NAC.
Why? But you haven't wiped out the other ones.
Well, those subcommittees are just for the NAC's review process under CASAC for the NAC standards. As soon as the 5-year review period is over, we start the next 5-year review. Yeah, but the agency has never met the 5-year deadline that is required under the Clean Air Act. Right. So we tried to reform the process in order to meet the deadline given to us by Congress.
You know, I think the concern is this combined with another policy you have where people who are providing, you know, in contracts to the EPA scientists, you're not allowing them to participate, but you're allowing other sort of industry lobbyists to participate. I think I'd like to continue this conversation with you because the credibility of the agency clearly is being hurt here when you disappear the climate page, when it appears that important subcommittees of scientists are being eliminated. And just to end with a point that Senator Udall made, as I understand it, the Assistant Administrator for Research and Development position, which was what this gentleman held during the Reagan administration, is unfilled. Is that correct?
It is. We've had a hard time filling positions because people look at how long the process takes, and they've told us no. You know, when you have the head of our Superfund and emergency response has been waiting 394 days for confirmation, we literally have had people say, we don't want to go through the Senate confirmation process. This confirmation process is broken, and I really hope it can be fixed on a bipartisan basis.
Well, I mean, there's the confirmation part of it. There's the confirmation part of it. There's also the reality that lots of people have not been appointed. We can't go through a confirmation process.
We've had people turned down because they look at how long.
The suggestion in this article from the person who held this position in the past is the reason scientists are not applying for the job is because they think that their work will be subject to political oversight and not scientific.
I've never met him, and I don't know how he's formed these opinions about me. We've never had any conversations, so I'm not sure why he believes that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I want to talk about some of the programs that have made a difference. You know, I'm listening to the comments from my colleague here, and while I respect the line of inquiry, what is on the website is not what people in Alaska are talking about. They're like, what are you doing to fix PM 2.5? What are you doing on our fish grinding issue? What are you doing on these things that are making a difference? And so I want to ask you about some of them because there's some frustration here with EPA. We have that in Alaska. We have that throughout all of our states. But to know that we're making a little bit of headway there is important. I mentioned in my opening that when it comes to the PM 2.5 issue and how Fairbanks, in a geographically constrained area with really no viable options to folks for keeping their homes warm in the winter time, turned to wood burning, and we've got some real particulate issues that we've been struggling with. The borough has been reclassified for non-attainment. There's states required to formulate and submit this air quality plan to demonstrate attainment by December 31. We've been struggling with this for years, and that's why I mentioned the targeted airshed grants. That has been the one thing that has been somewhat helpful to the Fairbanks North Star Borough in doing these wood stove changeouts. So I'm working with Senator Carper now on our bill, the Wood Heaters Emission Reduction Act. That's another little bright glimmer of hope. But what I need to know from you right now, EPA has been providing some technical assistance to the borough in formulating this plan that's due at the end of the year. People are very nervous. They're very anxious because there are very real on-the-ground repercussions. So how is EPA taking into account the unique situation that Fairbanks faces with its geography, its extremely low temperatures in the winter, and lack of access to cleaner fuels like natural gas? How are you working with the borough to address a plan by year end?
Fairbanks, as you know, has very unique issues, problems with the air quality. A lot of it's geographic, the way that the way the city sits, and of course the wood burning heat sources as well. We are working very closely with not only the city of Fairbanks but also the state to try to make sure that they can submit a state implementation plan before the end of the year. As you know, we've been sued. The EPA has been sued over this. If we're unsuccessful with working, if we can't get the state implementation plan by the end of the year, we will be forced to work on a federal implementation plan, which is something we do not want to do.
We do not want it either.
Yes. The Obama administration issued more federal implementation plans than the previous 4 administrations combined. And our track record on FIPS has been since March of 2017, we have turned 1 FIP into a SIP on a monthly basis, working with the states. So we have a very good track record of working with states and local communities to avoid FIPS and to change FIPS back into SIPs. Because the SIP is the state implementation plan, that's where we want to be. And we are working, I know my Region 10 regional administrator has been up in Alaska multiple times with the city of Fairbanks and the state, trying to provide additional tools, additional assistance, technical assistance as well, and we will continue to do that because our goal is to make sure that there is a SIP in place before the end of the year.
Well, know that is definitely what the borough is looking for. We need your help there, and again, the sooner the better. So we look forward to some of these important conversations moving forward. One of the things that we have dealt with in this committee, in this subcommittee, is the issue of small remote incinerators up north. In very remote areas that are inaccessible by road. They're critical for solid waste disposal. The options for using solid waste disposal are substantially more difficult, really unfeasible up north in some of these areas. And this is something that year after year we've actually included language within our appropriations subcommittee bill that basically gives us just yet a little bit more time this temporary relief problem. But I've gone to my colleagues on the subcommittee on the House and the Senate side, and I've promised them EPA is working with us to resolve this. It's going to be resolved this year, and we won't need to worry about this. And I can't keep going back to my colleagues and saying it's going to be resolved, it's going to be resolved. I really need to know that we will have an administrative solution on these, again, very few, but these small remote incinerators. So can you give me some assurance that we're going to see resolve this year?
We are certainly trying. This is another area where we have to work with the state for state implementation plan, and we're trying to make sure that they have the data that they need to submit a plan to us.
Well, I know that Senator Udall and Congresswoman McCollum will be really pleased when I come to them and say, we don't need this anymore because we have resolved that. So we'll be working with you and the state on that.
My ultimate goal is to make sure that all 4 of you are very pleased.
Well, that sounds like a good goal. Let me turn to Senator Udall.
I just want a brief comment about the staffing issue that you talked about. First of all, labor economists have been predicting baby boomer retirement effects for decades. This isn't news. Your agency has simply failed to plan and prepare and deal with the staffing deficit. So my opinion is you've known this was coming. The people in the department have known it was coming. You promised us you were going to be on top of it, and you failed on that front. One of the fundamental responsibilities of the EPA is to enforce our nation's environmental laws, but this administration is literally taking the cops off the beat. Administrative and civil penalties in fiscal year 2018 declined to the lowest level since EPA established a dedicated enforcement office 25 years ago. EPA also initiated roughly 1,800 civil enforcement cases in fiscal year 2018, the lowest level in a decade. I know the administration's party line response is that it is focusing on compliance ahead of problems rather than after the fact enforcement. But the numbers don't tell that story. EPA's own data indicates that the agency conducted 10,600 inspections in 2018, which is the lowest number in the last decade and less than half of the inspections conducted in the peak year of 2010. With fewer inspections, there are fewer opportunities to identify facilities that are out of compliance. It really isn't more complicated than that. And this focus on compliance, the budget request you bring us today asks for a $12 million cut to compliance. That's a full 12% cut. This administration's money is not where its mouth is. And Mr. Wheeler, the staffing levels for the headquarters enforcement office has plummeted by 19%. That's more than double the loss of the rest of the agency. And this subcommittee has not cut $1 from EPA. This subcommittee has not cut $1 from EPA enforcement. It's clear to me that this administration is turning its back on enforcing our environmental laws. And while that's friendlier to industry, it's a 5-alarm fire for our air quality and our water quality. Mr. Wheeler, if the administration's focus is on compliance and not enforcement, what are your specific goals and metrics to show that this approach will result in cleaner air and water? Specific metrics and goals.
Absolutely. First of all, when a state has primacy on the environmental programs, they're the ones who generally do the inspections, which is why the inspection numbers have been going down since 2010.
Yeah, well, but also, mind you, the budgets that have come up here have savaged money to the states. I mean, the budgets you've been presenting year after year, this administration, your partners are the states, you've delegated, but then you don't want to give them money to do the job. I mean, I don't know how you can get in this situation where you say, oh, we're going to let the states do it, but then when they're vital partners, it's very important for you to give them the money to do that. But focus in on the metrics. Sure. Show me that what you're doing is providing cleaner air and water to the American public.
The past metrics have focused on targeting industry sectors as a sector. What we are now targeting is non-attainment areas to get them to attainment. We're targeting impaired waters to get them to be safe drinking water. So we're focused on the environmental outcome. The pounds of pollution reduced because of our enforcement actions went up last year dramatically. We have stopped over, for example, 1 million aftermarket defeat devices since from being used in the cars here in the United States, which helps us on the non-attainment side because of the auto emissions contributing to non-attainment. In 2019, we've already stopped approximately 2,200 illegal vehicles and engines at the border. So what we're doing is trying to focus on areas where there's non-attainment to get those areas to attainment using our enforcement tools. And I'd point out that last year, the number of criminal cases went up for the first time since 2011. It's been on a downward trend, and we're reversing that trend. So yes, we are focusing on compliance and audits at the beginning of the process, but we're making sure that if people are violating the law, we're taking actions, including criminal action against them. So at both ends of the enforcement spectrum, but in the middle, we are working with the states to provide them more tools so that they do inspections. When we do inspections, and actually we just started this last year, in Region 8 as a pilot. Our inspectors were going out inspecting. Now we do the inspection, and then we provide a written report back to the facility afterwards. That has actually cut down in some of the inspection times of our people because they're spending extra days working on the reports to give the facilities so that they reach compliance faster.
Yeah, but mind you, you've also sent a budget up here to cut your compliance 12%. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. Administrator, it's good to see you here. In September of 18, really in your first few weeks on the job, you dealt with a big problem that's been a problem in our state, a big enough problem that had been on the Superfund priority list for 29 years. Hard to imagine anything that is really a priority is on the priority list for 29 years.
Absolutely.
And you and your predecessor worked from day one when you were the deputy administrator and now the administrator to come to a conclusion and did. The local feedback from Westlake's landfill, that area has been very positive. I think you've hit the right spot here to get this done. This morning, though, would you give me an update on what's going on there now and what are the next steps we need to take to get to the end of your planned way to deal with that?
We have been working on the ground. We've already started the remediation. We're continuing to keep the local citizen groups updated on our progress, and at this point, we are still on track of getting the site cleaned up and completed.
Is this a process of bidding someone to remove the things that are going to be removed?
I believe so at this point. I can give you a better update afterwards, but I believe so.
If you want to take that for the record,
Sure.
and then I'd like a sense of where you are now and maybe your projected calendar to how you're going to deal with those issues. Let me talk about one more thing while you're here. Under the RFS volume obligations, EPA grants retroactively waivers. I think we've talked about this when you were confirmed. When you retroactively grant waivers and don't reallocate the volume that those waivers would have represented, effectively, you decide on your own to reduce the volume of ethanol that's out there. I think whenever we had your confirmation hearing, you said you're going to look at how that exemption process works and make sure that the exemptions are warranted. I think you also were going to outline the process for review and really look seriously at what happens when you give a waiver but there's no reallocation of that amount. I think you've got 39 pending waivers, and I'd just like you to talk a little bit about how you're going to look at those waiver issues and if there's a way you can do this so that the legislated volume or the volume actually that you have determined should be the right volume actually is either the volume that year or added on to the volume for the next year.
With Senator, the small refinery exemption program, which is our process of providing waivers to the small refineries, which decreases the gallons for on the RFS program, is set up by statute. We've also previous administrations did not implement the program, and the EPA was sued 3 times and lost 3 times. So we now have 3 court orders on how to run the program, in addition to the statute as well as appropriations language at one point. But once we set the RVO for the following year, which we've done on time the last 2 years, first time that's ever happened.
Right.
After that, when we receive the small refinery waievers, and those come in after the RVOs are set, we don't have a process to go back to readjust the RVO. If we were to try to do that, that would probably send more small refiners into financial hardship based upon the number of gallons would then be spread out over fewer refineries. We have taken the move to be more transparent.
But when you exempt the small refiners, don't you spread out the gallons over the larger refiners?
No, we do not. And I believe that's the crux of the issue is that we aren't redistributing the small refinery gallons back into the system. Right. We don't have a mechanism to do that because we've already set the RVO for the compliance year, and that would throw all of the.
Do you need to give yourself a mechanism, or do we need to give you one, or is it just unreasonable to have that mechanism?
I think we would need to be given that mechanism, but I also think it would be very hard to try to implement something like that after the fact. On the 39 that you referred to, we haven't actually received those yet from the Department of Energy. The way the process works is that they apply to the Department of Energy. Department of Energy reviews the small refinery exemption applications. They have given us a list of the small refineries that have applied this year, but they haven't given us their underlying rationale and recommendations yet for those refineries. So as soon as we receive those, we then process them and either move forward, either grant or deny the small refinery.
And when you do that, by the time you get to that, it's retroactive because the year is basically already behind us. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. You and I can talk about this more, and we will. And again, thank you for your leadership on West Lakes, and thank you for the last 2 years of getting that RFS number out on time. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Administrator Wheeler, for coming before the committee. When you were being considered for nomination, I asked you on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being very concerned, how concerned were you about climate change? And you responded an 8 or 9, which means it's a pretty significant concern. So did you increase or decrease funding for climate programs in the 2020 budget as a result of your high level of concern about climate?
I'm sorry, which climate programs are you referring to? Because we are still moving forward on our 2 big climate regulations. We should finalize those this summer. The ACE proposal, which will reduce CO2.
Did you increase financing or decrease financing for the Global Change Research Program?
Of the global, yes. That has been eliminated, but we believe we can address those through our regulatory programs and other programs at the agency.
And did you increase or decrease funding for the Atmospheric Protection Program?
Decrease? That's correct. That has been decreased. Yes.
Was that the $365 million decrease for air quality programs? Or that was also you decreased other programs as well?
I'm sorry, I have to get back to you on that specifically.
Okay. So if you have a high level of concern, how come you're cutting the funding for key climate programs?
Because we are moving forward on our 2 regulations. Our ACE regulation will reduce CO2 from power plants by 34%. And our CAFE standard, which we also plan to finalize later this spring or early summer, will reduce CO2 emissions on par with what the Obama administration
I think the world is well aware that that effort will increase carbon pollution. But let's turn to lead. You're probably aware that lead is one of the major health threats for young children in our country. Nearly 500,000 U.S. children, just ages 1 through 5, have blood levels at or above the 5 microgram level, which is where the CDC recommends public health actions be taken. I think you probably understand that there's no safe blood level, but that this is a very serious impact on the developing brains of our children across America. And yet your 2020 proposed budget slashes EPA's lead program. Why?
It's the lead paint, which is actually, we work closely with HUD. We are moving forward with our lead dust regulation. This should be finalized by June. And then we're also proposing our lead and copper pipe rule, which is the first time that regulation has been modernized in over 20 years. So we are moving forward very aggressively on lead, but that particular lead program that you referred to, we found within the administration that was duplicative of what HUD was doing. So we're deferring to HUD on the lead paint, but we're moving forward on the regulations for lead dust, which again will be out in June, and we'll be proposing a lead and copper rule this summer, which will go a long ways to reducing lead exposure to families, and we're looking at mandatory testing in both schools and daycare centers.
Well, it's funny because while you're talking about some future regulation, you're cutting the program for state and tribal assistance grants for lead testing in schools, which means less lead is detected, less action is taken. And so the net impact is that more children get poisoned, and that's really unfortunate under your leadership that more children are going to be poisoned.
We also requested $50 million for our Healthy Schools program, which will be working with schools, not just public schools and private schools, but also tribal schools to address lead and other contaminants located in the schools.
The Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds are something very valuable to particularly my rural communities. When I go to every county every year. I hold a public town hall. I meet with the commissioners and any other electeds beforehand, school boards, city commissioners, so forth. Almost always what comes up is the challenge of clean water supply and wastewater treatment. And it's just a critical piece of infrastructure. Under your proposed budget, states would lose 31% of their potential funding under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. I know that my rural communities are desperate for more assistance because it's so expensive for a small town to do a treatment center. You just can't spread the costs among enough residents in those smaller towns. So this is going to have a huge impact on infrastructure in rural America. Why would you want to do that to rural America?
Well, the amount that we're asking for this year is at a reduction, but you have to remember that the overall funds currently available in the overall SRFs across the whole country is $80 billion. We also asked for more funding for AWEA this year. I'm sorry, for WIFIA this year. And AWEA, which passed by Congress last fall, did not receive any money this year, but we're requesting $83 million for that. And there's a number of different small grant programs in the new AWEA legislation. So what we're trying to do is look to see, we know we've been successful in the SRFs, but in order to reach more smaller communities, we think some of the funding mechanisms in the AWEA legislation might be very helpful there. So that's why we're asking for money for that legislation, or for that new statute that was passed last fall. So we're asking for $83 million for AWEA. We asked for an increase over our budget request last year for WIFIA. And with the total amount of money available through the SRFs, we're looking at $80 billion, because every time we put money out through the SRF, it gets repaid. We're also earning interest on it. So there's that bank of money has increased substantially over the years.
Well, I am glad you mentioned WIFIA, Water Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act, because it's an act that I wrote, and I'm pleased it's there. But unfortunately, it's not working for small communities because the fees, administrative fees that are being charged by the administration are too high. I would like to encourage you to take a look and advocate with administration how to make that program work for small communities.
We're trying that. We've looked at trying to get a few small communities to band together for a loan. We're looking at that in Indiana, for example, where there's several small communities. But we think the new AWEA legislation might actually be better for small communities. So that's why we requested, bless you, that's why we requested money for AWEA.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Merkley, and thank you for clarifying that, because I think we recognize, certainly in my state, that the opportunities with WIA are considerable for the smaller communities. Let's go to Senator Daines.
Thank you, Chair Murkowski. Mr. Wheeler, I want to commend you for your leadership of the agency and a renewed focus on achieving results for the American people. One area where Montanans have really seen an increased focus is on our Superfund sites. I'm pleased you've ranked our Butte Silverbow and Anaconda sites with the highest priority for cleanup and restoring to reuse, and our Libby asbestos site on the EPA's list with greatest potential of redevelopment. That is direction from the top that Montanans have long sought for. Now we need to make sure the actions are executed effectively for Montana. One aspect of the remedy involves the restoration of the Butte Silverbow Creek site is restoring Silverbow Creek to a natural stream. I've heard from EPA and ARCO that there may be some limitations to restoring a full functioning natural stream in this area. My question is, what do we need to do in Congress to remedy these obstacles?
Well, first of all, Senator, thank you for showing me both of those sites last summer. I enjoyed that visit to Montana, and it was really educational to see that firsthand.
And you were the first EPA administrator to ever visit both of those sites.
I believe in at least over 20 years.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
I was very happy to do that, and it was very educational for me. We are working, and I just actually had a briefing on this last week. I was in our Denver office. I had a teleconference with a call with our Montana field office, our Denver people who are working on these two sites, and our DC people working on these two sites for an update. I have to be careful because some of this hasn't been announced yet, and we're working out we're working out with ARCO and the parties, and we have to go back to the court for this as well. But we're trying to make sure that in the future, if a water source is identified for the creek, that would be a possibility. Some of that, though, is not within the remediation side of a Superfund site. It might be more on the natural resource damages side, but not the remediation side. So we are constrained in some aspects of what we can do, but we have communicated to the PRPs the importance of that for the community, and we're trying to make sure that our Superfund remediation effort there will allow the restoration of that creek in the future. Yeah, and that the remediation techniques won't impede that from happening.
Well, thank you. I can tell by just your responding there, you're actively engaged on this issue.
Yes, I am.
I can tell you're not looking at your notes, you're talking about it from firsthand experience, and I appreciate that greatly for your engagement. And I know the folks in the community there I can't wait to see this come to some closure. Regarding the Anaconda Superfund site, it's my understanding there's been some progress made in the consent decree for the Anaconda Smelter Superfund site, but I've heard there may be a speed bump. Can you assure me that the EPA is staying firm to ensure the site will be secure into perpetuity?
Yes, I'm not aware of a speed bump, and I'd be happy to talk to you and your staff about that afterwards. It's my understanding we're still on plan to execute the consent decree by this December.
Okay, thank you.
That's what I was told last week.
Yeah, and it's the in perpetuity piece here we want to make sure. And I know you're engaged. Thank you for working with us closely, and particularly for the EPA's active presence on the ground there with the community, restoring that trust and that dialogue. I want to shift gears and talk about asbestos for a moment. As you know, due to asbestos contamination, mining vermiculite in northwest Montana, there's been a terrible legacy of asbestos-related pulmonary problems for my constituents throughout that area. We're talking about Libby primarily. In fact, over 2,000 individuals in northwest Montana have been diagnosed with an asbestos-related pulmonary disease at Libby's Card Clinic. In fact, furthermore, just last summer, a preschool in Missoula was found to have an unacceptably high level of asbestos exposure, and children had to be immediately relocated. Clearly, our country has known for a while that asbestos presence can be dangerous to human health. I believe it's very important, as a chemical engineer, that we base decisions on sound science. You said that your goal remains to have it complete this EPA's risk evaluation. I think Senator Tester brought this up earlier, to have this completed by December. My communities in Montana are eager for progress. We've known for a while the dangers of asbestos, and we want to protect others from the tragedies that we've seen in Montana. So I want to thank you for going a step beyond what was required under TSCA with a significant new use rule regarding asbestos. My question is, why did the EPA list specific uses of asbestos instead of banning all new uses?
We're about to go final on the significant new use rule, and we are looking at that. We took comment, and that's part of our deliberation at this point. But I do want to, because there's a lot of misinformation in the press last year when we announced the significant new use. The TSCA process takes several years from start to finish, and we wanted to make sure that no new, I have to be careful not to prejudge. We were concerned that there could be importation of asbestos products into our country. We're seeing asbestos showing up in products in Russia and China. So the only way to ensure that the EPA is aware of that ahead of time is the significant new use rule, which would allow us, before an importer could import a new product containing asbestos, that they would have to go to us for permission, and we could then deny it. There was no mechanism to do that prior to our significant new use rule. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to do to close that loophole. Right. And I was accused last year in the press of trying to open up the markets to all kinds of asbestos products, and that is the furthest thing from the case.
Yeah, well, I thank you for staying very engaged and active on this issue as well. I want to work with you. I want to work on legislation to do just that. Mm-hmm. I think it's more predictable for all parties involved. I want to see an outcome that protects the people of this country and in Montana, and my goal is to help prevent these future tragedies like we have seen in places like Libby.
When I was a career staffer at EPA in the early 90s in the toxics office, the EPA program had a setback on the asbestos regulation. Part of that was overturned by the court, and the agency hasn't tried to address asbestos since then. With the new TSCA, I think we can address these issues, and the significant new use rule is supposed to be the stopgap measure until we finish the risk assessment and the regulation of asbestos, but we are moving forward for the first time in over 25 years to try to address asbestos.
Okay. Thank you, Administrator.
Thank you, Senator Daines. Administrator Wheeler, I've just got a couple more quick ones, and I'm going to run over to Homeland Security and Approps and ask a couple questions over there before we gavel out. But Senator Blunt is going to be here with Senator Udall as we wrap up. Just very quickly, this is an issue that we've discussed before: fish grinding. Not necessarily pertinent to either one of my colleagues on either side of me, but for us, we've made some headway working with you on the offshore fish grinding. Thank you for helping us with that effort, but we're still dealing with the onshore processing issue. Even with the best available technology, 100% compliance with the permit requirements is not achievable because of the nature of the seafood waste. This results in extensive noncompliance reporting under the EPA permits, serves as a constant threat of enforcement risk and loss. So I would ask once again for your commitment to work with me to ensure that our onshore fish processors are not going to face fines for simply doing everything that they can to comply with the regulation. I don't know if you have any updates for me, but that is something, again, that we have to get resolved.
We are supposed to have our draft general permit for public review published early this month.
Okay.
For public comment.
This month, April,
yes,
so
April.
Sometime in the next week or so?
Yes, I planned for early April. Yes, Senator.
Okay, we will look forward to that. And then another perennial issue is the diesel generators in our remote communities. The EPA reg that requires any diesel generator purchased after model year 2014 required to have a diesel particulate filter installed, even if it's used as a primary power generator. So you know this issue very well. In terms of the high cost of compliance to many of our small remote communities, and your regulatory review panel set up as a result of Executive Order 13777. So we've asked the EPA to re-examine the reg related to these diesel engines. So again, if you have a current status on that, but anything that you can do to demonstrate your commitment to work with us. This is particularly important, as you know, with regards to our microgrids scattered all throughout the state.
Sure. I'm told that we should be issuing a notice of proposed rulemaking and direct final rule in June of this year.
Looking forward to it. Administrator, I really appreciate your in-depth responses to some of these questions, getting into real performance on initiatives, many of which have been hanging out there for a long period of time. Know that I look forward to working with you. I'm going to yield the rest of my time here to Senator Udall, and thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're as you know, Administrator Wheeler, almost 3 years since the passage of overwhelming bipartisan reform of TSCA. And I know you're aware how involved I was in that. So you can imagine my disappointment when the very first chemical regulation you took, methylene chloride, was a watered-down rule that walks back protections for workers. EPA recently finalized a ban on all consumer uses of the chemical methylene chloride in paint strippers. Inexplicably, the ban failed to cover workers as the original proposed ban did, despite the fact that the vast majority of more than 50 deaths from this chemical have occurred in the workplace. In fact, I've met with the mother of Kevin Hartley, who died at age 21 while working using a methylene chloride-based stripper he had been trained to use. We know that people are dying using these strippers on the job. In finalizing the consumer ban, EPA found unreasonable risk of acute human lethality. That means that EPA has already found that this chemical in paint strippers and coating removers poses an unreasonable risk of acute human lethality. Is that correct? That you found that?
Yes, I believe that is correct, but you're being very specific. I want to make sure I don't I'd like to get back to
I believe you've made the finding.
Yeah.
Unreasonable risk of acute human lethality. I'm using the actual words of your agency. The answer clearly is yes. EPA found that this chemical in paint strippers and coating removers poses an unreasonable risk of acute human lethality. And the EPA is aware that workers have died using this product on the job. Is that correct?
That is, but what we did was institute a comment period for training and certification, which has never been in place before. And if we during the comment period, if we determine that we cannot have a program that will guarantee training and certification that will safeguard the workers, then we can move to ban it for the workers as well.
Yeah. Well, the young man that I spoke about was trained, and
he wasn't trained by a program set up by the federal government. That was a training by his employer or by the manufacturer. So what we're looking at is whether or not the product can be safely used by trained people under a training and certification program by the EPA and the federal government.
Yeah. Well, I understand you have a pre-proposal to consider measures that could address any unreasonable risk that EPA could potentially find to be presented by methylene chloride when used for commercial paint and coating removal. But we know that the EPA has already found that there are unreasonable risks of human lethality from methylene chloride, and we know that workers are at risk. To me, it's clear that workers as well as consumers need protection. I know that Kevin Hartley's mother, Wendy, would agree with that. This is not the TSCA reform we all spent so much time and effort working on. Now, I'd like to turn quickly to an important regulatory issue that EPA is working on in my home state. That's the cleanup of the chemical PFAS. As you know, Mr. Administrator, the way the EPA is set up to interact with the state environment departments is very different from how other agencies are set up. State environment departments have delegated authority, as we've talked about here, for things like the Safe Water Drinking Act and the Resource Recovery Act. So EPA delegates primary enforcement responsibility to states and Indian tribes to clean up the contamination. As you probably know, the state of New Mexico is currently trying to compel the Air Force to clean up PFAS contamination of groundwater that has resulted from firefighting foam used at 2 Air Force bases in New Mexico. And now there's also ongoing litigation. Given that the New Mexico Environment Department has primacy and delegation agreements from EPA, I think the EPA is obligated to provide technical and legal assistance on groundwater cleanup on these matters. Will you commit to provide EPA's assistance to the state of New Mexico's Environment Department as they work to clean up PFAS contamination?
It is my understanding we've already offered assistance to them. If we haven't, we certainly will. But we've worked with a couple of dozen states and local communities on enforcement actions for PFAS, PFOA across the country. And I don't know why we would not do that for New Mexico.
We're happy to have that commitment. The tricky part, and Mr. Chairman, I just want to clarify this, the very tricky part is they're in litigation with the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense. So we hope that the information you share with the state is not shared with their opponents, that it can be held confidential, because we're in an unusual situation where the Air Force is trying to push down the standards and the Department of Defense. There are a lot of reports on this. They want the PFAS standards to be lower. And so it's important to us that you share information with New Mexico on a confidential basis. Can you do that?
Yes, and we do that with federal facilities all around the country and a number of different statutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Back to the
Thank you, Senator Udall. Thank you, Administrator Wheeler, for being with us today. The record will stay open for 1 week for additional questions and your responses. This committee is adjourned.
Thank you.